clear that outsourcing and leveraging third-party technology vendors is something that's been talked about quite a bit today, both on some of the speaks, but also in some of the roundtables. And I hope that we can add a little bit more flavor to that conversation, because what we're going to be spending the next half hour or so on is talking about the do's and the don'ts of digital outsourcing. I think outsourcing is something that is not maybe the most sexy topic I think we can agree on, but I think it's also, like Thomas is mentioning, something that is becoming increasingly important. So we thought it would be a good thing to address today with you guys. With outsourcing, it is something that we have had quite a bit of experience with in Pixelz over the years, you know, in everything from payroll management to finance to even some software development, production, you name it. So we have a lot of experiences in vetting and managing different types of partners. And you can say on the flip side, we are essentially an outsourced partner for our clients. So we're kind of in between. We've seen, you know, when these partnerships are really successful and when they're less successful. And that's kind of what we're here to talk about today, because there is, in fact, a right way to do outsourcing and a wrong way to do outsourcing. But if we start with why to do outsourcing in the first place, this is something that, you know, traditionally has been a big topic when it comes to the manufacturing industries, right? I think most brands have been producing their goods somewhere abroad. Now this is transferring way more into the digital type of outsourcing. And we're seeing this being much more prevalent to less of human-intensive, you can say, skills or functions. So I think with Thomas, what he's also mentioning is that this is something that's developing really rapidly right now. And I bet that pretty much, okay, I'll go with the majority of everybody in this room have used some type of outsourcing. That could be outsourcing parts of production in photo, post, copy, you know, digital asset management, whatever it may be. So let's see if I'm right in my hypothesis. Let's do a show of hands if some point in your career you've used some type of outsourcing. Yes, it's a good start. That was definitely the vast majority. And I don't think there's a big surprise in that. It is definitely something that is used quite a lot in our industry as well. I think what we are now seeing is that we are moving away from the old ways. The traditional way of doing outsourcing was something that was extremely focused on cutting costs, more or less at all costs, and not necessarily in a healthy way. It was a very transactional way of doing these types of relationships. It was with very little transparency, and it was a one-way street. The good thing is things are changing, and they're changing pretty fast. In 2022, so a year ago, Deloitte did a survey on more than 500 business leaders across a variety of industries worldwide. And what they found was there is a clear shift in how we are doing outsourcing and where outsourcing is going. So rather than leveraging third-party vendors to reduce costs, as was the norm in 2020, organizations are using third parties to tackle their greatest challenges, such as protecting their business and keeping up with rapid technological advances. Just think about that for a moment, 2020. So the focus is now moving away from the traditional way, where it's very heavily focused on costs, to keeping up with technology and tapping into a global talent pool. And this shift has been escalating over the last 2-3 years. And you say, in the last 2-3 years, what happened in the last 2 years? COVID. So there's been a huge COVID accelerator in how outsourcing is being done. Because before COVID, there were a lot of leaders, a lot of organizations that didn't really believe in remote work. All of a sudden, they were forced to doing remote work. And what they found out is that people can actually be efficient. Teams can be efficient when using remote work. You don't necessarily have to be in the same office, in the same studio. So what that also did was that opened up the scope of what could possibly be outsourced and where they could leverage third-party vendors. And this is a huge part of why we're seeing this shift. At the same time, we're also seeing a big shift in the aspects that these leaders are valuing in a service provider. All of a sudden, the top two are transparency and trustworthiness. And I can tell you this was not the same in 2020 when they did the survey. So we're seeing a huge change in a very short time, and I think this speaks also a lot to what we talked about earlier. And I can tell you that I'm really, really happy personally to see how this shift is taking place in front of us now, because we've had you can say, the pleasure and have the pleasure of working with hundreds of medium to enterprise-sized businesses. And I can tell you that there is a very, very clear correlation between the ceiling for what can be achieved, the success of the relationship, with transparency, trust, and openness. So I think we can say that while we've been talking a lot about technology potentially disrupting operations, how we're working, it's actually also disrupting outsourcing, which is kind of interesting because they're all linked together. So in one way, we're saying that, like I just mentioned, technology now makes it possible for us to work with outsourced partners or in-house teams that are working remotely in a radically different way. Like we now have Teams, Zoom, we have workflow management software, we got project management software where we can collaborate no matter where we are. There's a level of transparency built into how we can work together now that didn't happen before or that wasn't available before. In a different way, you can say that, like Thomas is mentioning again, Thomas, I'm giving you a lot of credit here, is that with the speed of the technology advancements, it is so difficult now to keep up with what's going on that we are almost forced to rely on the community that we're in, the partners that are within this community, and that are looking into solutions that we may not be able to solve ourselves. So I think a great example, it's been almost the talk of the event so far, generative AI. Imagine if you're being tasked to build a framework in your team to implement in your organization for generative AI. Where would you start? You don't have to answer right now. But it will be pretty difficult, right? So one thing, let's say you find a way to do that. You're not software developers, at least not most of you. I know Ivan is here somewhere. But it's also taken away a ton of focus on what is actually your core competencies and what motivates you. And that's super important. So if we are to sum up the shift that we're seeing and what I would call the smart outsourcing instead of the traditional outsourcing, basically what it allows us to do is it allows you to focus on your business. It allows you to get access to the right talent at the right time. It allows you to test and implement some of these new technologies on an ongoing level. If you're testing with a partner, it doesn't mean you have to buy it. It doesn't mean you have to implement it. But testing, maybe you need to test 10 different types of solutions before you choose one. But if you have to do it yourself, it's not going to happen, right? It also allows you overall to build scalable processes and teams to leverage the best of both worlds, if you may. And it gives you the flexibility to handle the peaks and valleys that we talked about before. Adrian mentioned it around video, for instance. We know this industry is filled with peaks and valleys, and it's extremely difficult to handle if you only have in-house teams to rely on. And of course, essentially, this is something that helps you remove bottlenecks and bring down your lead times, which, at least for many of you, are some of your main KPI. All right. So now we've established that outsourcing parts of the operation can be extremely valuable. I'm not saying it works for everyone. I'm not saying it works for all tasks, all functions. I think that's something that people need to assess individually, what works for us, test it out, what adds value, what doesn't. But I'm pretty certain that this is something that adds value to, if not all organizations, then most organizations. But now let's look at how to find the right partner. But before we do that, since transparency, we've established that being extremely important, let's do a little exercise first. So, how often are you late to work? So in a minute, I'm going to ask you to raise your hand if you're one of these four. And if your boss is here too, maybe consider your answer, but try to be as truthful as possible, right? So show of hands, how many prefer not to answer this question? Okay, a couple, I think. How many are never late for work? Ryan, I see you. All right, quite a few. How many are occasionally late for work? Okay, I see some honesty in the room. That's nice to see. How many are consistently late for room? We talked about transparency, right? Okay, let's flip it around. So now you're the one in a higher position. You're the team lead. You need to make a hire, okay? So you got two options. You have two candidates. They match one-to-one, except for one point. They answered differently on this question. So who would you hire? Would you hire the one that prefer not to answer if they're late? Or would you hire the one that is consistently late for work? Okay, so first of all, who would hire the one that prefer not to answer? 5-ish, handful? Okay, so who would hire the one that is consistently late for work? Interesting. That is the vast majority. Okay, very interesting. It's actually very much in alignment with a big study that was recently conducted with hundreds of executives where they were asked the exact same question. And isn't that interesting? 82%, I think you were maybe around the same in here, 80, 90% I would guess, answered the exact same thing. So we would much rather hire somebody that we know is going to be late every day than hire somebody that just didn't answer the question. They just didn't answer it. What does that tell you about what we value as humans and in our relationships, right? We'd much rather work with somebody that is honest with us, that is open with us, that is transparent with us. We can work with that, even if they're flawed. But if they don't open up, what's there to work on, right? All right? Okay, moving on in the process. We're still looking for our partner. So the next step is to know your goals, right? What problems are you solving? Don't implement new partners, new technologies for the sake of doing it. It benefits nobody. Make sure you're solving a problem. Make sure you set goals, and you know how you measure those goals. If you don't measure it, you won't get it. And then make sure to communicate these goals internally and with your partner. This is extremely important. If your partner doesn't know what your goals are, why you're working together, what they're steering after, how they're going to help you, right? Same thing goes for your internal team. It's really important to try to work with, and I think somebody pretty much said this earlier, to try to create an ecosystem between internal and external teams. And I know this can be really daunting and very difficult, but it's extremely important. Transparency again, all right? Communicate with your team that you're actually looking to outsource. Explain to them why that's the case. Then they'll understand. Whether that's enabling, using your internal team to do more elevated campaigns, or whatever it may be, like we heard from Adrian earlier as well. Whether that is something that helps your company scale, bringing in new tech that makes sure that you're relevant in the market space. Whatever it is, make sure that you involve them in the process. Obviously, I know sometimes this will mean that somebody is going to lose their job, and maybe think about how you communicate it, but more often than not, that is not the case. Remember, in the process, this is a two-way street. We saw the traditional way, the one-way street. That is not a very successful street. Make sure that you set yourself up for success by defining what is your short, medium, and long-term goals with your partner. And make sure there's something that benefits both parties. Avoid the yes people. I think we all know these. We've been in pitches where you've had 20 questions. The answer's been yes, 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 yes. no matter what you're throwing at them, it can be done. This should set off your alarm bells. If nobody is pushing back, if nobody has slightly critical questions, this is probably not a route you want to go down, because then it's not going to be a two-way street, and you're not going to maximize the potential value of the relationship. We're not going to get around this one. Compliance. Again, not super sexy, but it has to be done. These are basically the table stakes. You need to check the boxes of data insecurity, corporate social responsibility, sustainability. These are table stakes. This is the minimum of what your partner needs to provide for you. And these are actually something that where digital outsourcing has been very different than the traditional outsourcing. Like, there's been much, much less scrutiny on digital outsourcing. But why is that? Does that make any sense? There's also people involved in this. It's labor-intensive work, whichever way you look at it. So how does that make any sense that we're not looking at this the exact same way? Why are we not setting any expectations around labor rights, fair wages, work environment, etc.? You'll be shocked how low the bar is out there when looking at ethical outsourcing, digital outsourcing. And I think it's time as an industry that we are raising that bar. All right, when making the final decision, I encourage you heavily to take references. So you checked all the boxes, but make sure you take references. Get on a call with 2 or 3 clients that the partner is already working with. Make sure you get that first-hand impression of what it's really like to be working with the partner. If they don't want to give it to you, back to transparency, probably shouldn't be working with them. And then involve your team. Before you make the decision, before you start onboarding, make sure you involve your team. That way you can get their buy-in. And I can promise you that onboarding afterwards of the partner is going to be so much easier. You're going to fight with much less if you involve them in the process. All right. After you start, we're getting very tangible here. Make sure you have regular check-ins. Make sure that you have shared KPI dashboards so we know we're on track. And if we're not on track, make sure we're working on this together to resolve it. Doing quality business reviews. Making sure you're constantly testing, adopting new solutions and technologies. And make sure that you get some face time. Because even though we have all these technologies now, nothing really replaces face time, especially when it comes to building relationships. And at the end of the day, it is all about building relationships. So I would say the goal should be for the partner to really function as an extension of your team and not an opposition. And I think as much as we need to have good contracts and SLAs in place to make sure that we have complete alignment, make sure we know what we're expecting from each other, I think true partnerships are the ones where you put the contract in the drawer and then you never look at it again. Because the most successful partnerships are defined by all the things that are not in the contract. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jakob. I actually wondered when, with that raise of hands, if people were late or not for work. I wonder if we did something first. How many children do you have and how young are they? I have a lot and they're young. Yep, my hand is up. I'm always late for work, right? I think there could be some causality in that. Good, all right. Jakob, time for some Q&A?
Let's do it.
Let's do it. How to identify the right, or almost right, or the best possible partner without going into the deep research and testing. As there are many tools, it's essential. It's essential to shortlist first, right?
Yeah, and I guess my first thinking is that, especially when we're talking about tools here, I think there's a big difference between, things that is like an off-the-shelf product, where it's more or less plug and play, and something that is, let's say, an outsourced, like if we're outsourcing photo, outsourcing post-production, where there's going to be a lot more at stake, if you may, and there's going to be a lot more people involved. It's going to be an ongoing thing. So I think it's fair to kind of split those up. I mean, if we're implementing a new, webinar tool, maybe we don't need to go as granular as I just described. But if we're opening with a new, post-production partner, then we have to go through this. So I think you also need to consider again, like how important is this to your business? What is the risk of not going through this? I think that's probably where I would start.
Yeah.
And then I think probably deep down you know if you need to spend the time and energy in going through this.
Good. Perfect, thank you. Next question up here. How do you balance ethical outsourcing? Cheaper usually means extortion of labor versus other options like Vietnam versus India.
I'm not really sure exactly with the Vietnam versus India, which one is, but I think in general, I guess I get the question. I mean, can we compromise? Like, is that a question? Like, honestly, like, what about your teams? Would you offer them lower than the minimum wage? Is that an option? No? Are you then working with partners that are paying below minimum wage? Is that an option? And if so, why is that? So I think I'll probably answer that with a question, because I think that is maybe the most important question that we need to ask ourselves. Why are those two separated? Because they shouldn't be. It's our responsibility. If we're using a partner, it's our responsibility to make sure that they're paid and treated the right way. We can't just sit on our hands and look away and say, it's not our business. But it is. If you're using the service, it's your responsibility.
True. Any tips on how to tell when somebody is a yes person versus telling the truth?
I don't know if there's an exact science. If somebody has one, then please let me know. I think, of course, just like with so many other things, you build up experience when going through this. And I think maybe if you don't have the experience of vetting right partners in your team, maybe that's something, if it's big enough, you potentially want to bring in somebody that's actually experienced in doing just that, because it has major implications if you don't choose the right partner. So I think that's one thing. Experience helps a lot. And I don't think we're definitely not perfect either. Like we also make mistakes and in this and learn from that. But I think asking questions, getting under the skin a little bit, I think is super important. And then take references. Get real client references, and then they can tell you what it really is to work with this partner.
Cool. And then there's one more here that has kept me a little busy during the breaks today, I can tell you. Why do you think digital and physical outsourcing is judged so differently?
That's a good one. And I don't want to sound so negative up here, right? But I don't know. This is 100% on me. I think my best guess, my best take on this is that there's been some major scandals in the physical outsourcing industry. Yeah. That has put a loop on this. Because before, we know what happened in Bangladesh, as 10 years ago or something like that. It's huge. Like, so many people passed away, right? And I think that changed the industry, because now they're forced to do it. I know this is not something that people necessarily want to hear, but sometimes it takes an incident like that before the world and the politicians and the regulators wake up. And I don't think this has happened yet in the digital outsourcing industry. So I hope that we can make up for this before we get to such a point that we don't need that type of wake-up call. But again, this is just my take on it.
Good, Jakob, I think we're done. I can add to that little last part about the breaks today. We're actually in discussions right now with a pretty big, very, very, very high-end fashion company working out of France. And we've had an online audit in our Hanoi office. And we passed it.
Not online, on-site.
On-site. And we actually passed it with flying colors, except for a certain part of it, we completely failed. Because this auditing company, they blamed us that we weren't able to calculate the CO2 emission from transporting goods in our production facility. it's like, hello, we do not do physical production. We don't transport goods. So there you actually have, right, a whole system and a whole setup for auditing that is like based on the good old-fashioned physical outsourcing and now operating in a completely different way. I mean, we work in office in Hanoi. It could be like it is, programmers, editors, so on. It might as well be accountants or lawyers or whatever. It doesn't make a difference. It's the exact same kind of operation. So there, sometimes you actually need to battle what is what here versus, physical knowledge, outsourcing versus physical production. Great. Jakob, thank you. You may go down.